There we go. That's great, Mike. Thank you. Really excited to join all of you today. I kind of joked when we logged on that I've been waiting all day to connect with you because I'm joining you today from Newfoundland and Labrador. So, you know, just down the street, really. Was really excited to connect with WCB Yukon on this topic because I've been working about 20 years in Atlantic Canada in a number of different areas, but all under the theme of keeping people safe at work and returning people back to work who have had an injury. And that's come in the form of rehabilitation. My background is occupational therapy. I've worked in claims, prevention. And when I look back, the thing that really resonated with me through all of that I kept coming up with time and time again is the impact that a psychologically safe workplace has on keeping people at work and then also returning them to work. And I would also say, as I work with leaders, it's hands down the thing that I get the most questions about. What does this mean? How do we do this? What does this look like? And that's really what I'm gonna, that's my point of view, right? That's my experience that I'll bring to you today. So super excited to join you. I will ask that you use the chat, right? One of the things that I really miss from this pandemic that we're all living through is being in the room with folks, right? You see the body language, you get to have interaction. So really we'll get that from the chat. So feel free to make comments, ask questions, as Mike said, and we'll go from there. So what is it? We've got about 30 minutes together. And, you know, it would be foolish to think that I was going to be able to equip us all to be experts in violence and harassment legislation and how to implement it. But what I really want to do in the next 30 minutes is give you lots of opportunities to think and reflect on this new legislation. I'm going to challenge you to think about yourself, what you think about it, what you feel about it. And then I want to share with you 3 guiding principles that I think are really key in making this legislation alive and well in your workplaces, because that's really what it's about. And how I want you to feel when we're done with this. So a lot of times when I work with leaders and there's a new piece of legislation, or in particular talking about mental health in the workplace, it can feel overwhelming. People don't know where to start. But what I really hope after our 30 minutes together is that it doesn't seem that daunting. For those of you that it might feel that way, I hope you feel encouraged and optimistic. And I hope you feel ready to walk away from this morning, ready to do some things that you know and you feel that you can do, that you're confident to do, and that will make a difference. And I think what you're going to find is that it's not complex stuff. It's simple, but with huge impact. And I would guess you're already doing some of it, which is super exciting. So a couple of things before we jump right in. So in the chat, can I just get a sense of the industries that you're from? So I took a look as you were piping up there when we introduced ourselves, but do we have government, mining, healthcare? What's the industries that people are involved in? So we got healthcare, government, awesome, thank you. Community corrections, lots of government, hospital. Okay, union, thank you. Okay, right, yeah, I noticed the status of women. Government, lots of government. Okay. And then what about, can you just type in if you are an actual supervisor in your role? Do you supervise people? Manager, yes, supervisor. So we've got a lot of that on the line. Okay, some don't, a mix, nice. Great. What about health and safety professionals on the line? Yep. Perfect. Okay. Adult educator. Great mix. Awesome. Thank you for that. So as I said, my background is occupational therapy. I worked for that in a long time. I was a regional director. I still work for WCB Yukon's counterpart in New Brunswick, WorkSafe New Brunswick. And then as Mike said, I also do some consulting through Trailhead. And Trailhead is all about helping workplaces find their own path to psychological safety in a way that's right for them. So before I launch in, I want you to do one thing for yourselves. I want you to be kind to your mind. Let your mind just focus on one thing this morning, because I know I do it. I check emails when I'm attending virtual stuff, right? I draft read documents and all that sort of stuff. It's so easy to be distracted. But what we know about psychological safety, a couple of the things that are really important is balance and managing your workload. So I think a lot of this starts with ourselves, right? So try, that's my challenge to you. We've got about 25 minutes left, is just sort of close what you can and focus on this stuff. So new legislation, anytime I'm talking to leaders, and anytime I work with different companies, they usually fall into one of these buckets. Health and safety legislation is a burden. Here come Kurt and his team again with something else now. I got to build a new thing, right? For some folks, though, it's a priority, right? And then for other companies, it's really, truly a driving value of how they operate. And I'm going to guess, because you showed up today, that you probably are falling somewhere between a 2 and perhaps a 5. That would be my guess. Typically, when health and safety is kind of perceived as being a bit of a burden, not valuable, people don't show up to learn about it. But I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about where you fall and where your organization falls when you think about this new legislation. Were you excited? Were you like, thank goodness, because we value this matters. And now we have some teeth behind it to help us out. Or did you just think this is a little too much for what I think we need to have? Now, what I will tell you is I get asked this all the time, particularly leaders who are finding that they're not able to advance their workplace in health and safety. They'll just say, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. What's that one thing that's going to make it better? What's that one thing that's going to reduce our incidents, reduce our recordables, whatever the case. And I really talk to them a lot about, well, there isn't one thing, right? Just because we have new legislation that's not the one thing that makes us have really sustainable safety cultures, in particular around violence and harassment. Policies and procedures, again, that's not the one thing, and our people just are not the one thing either. It's all of it, right? It's really understanding the role that each of these things play and how they complement each other and integrate to drive the safety culture that we want, right? Kurt was talking about policies and procedures, right? And without them, it's chaotic. There's no consistency. We end up being reactive instead of proactive and all that stuff. When we, don't have the people part, those policies, procedures, and checklists often go unused or inconsistently used, or there's a fear of speaking up and reporting hazards. And what I've found is that we usually do better with that top line, right? And you can see by the picture, sometimes we overdo it, right? Because a lot of companies and folks will drive at that, another policy, another checklist. And we really struggle with the people part of things. And I want to share a story with you. I was working a few years ago with a sawmill, and they were a small sawmill in New Brunswick, struggling a lot. And you can imagine there's a lot of high risk in sawmills. And then they had a lot of serious injuries, amputations, trapped in conveyor belts, falls. And we were working with some safety leadership development. So it was workshops, and I met with the president, and he said, yep, we need to do this. Nothing's working. We have all the policies. We have all the procedures. I don't know what else to do to get my people to do the right thing. And so I met with him to explain to him what this was, what these workshops were, what the development opportunities were. And I was telling him who was the intended audience. And it was all of his leaders. I said, so anybody in your workplace that supervises another human, that's who this is for. And I remember him putting down his pen, and he looked up at me and he said, what are you talking about, Nancy? He said, my workers are not making the right choices, and you're not even going to meet with them. And I thought, there it is, right? We don't automatically make that connection that knowledge and giving people policies and procedures isn't enough on its own. And I talked to him about the impact of the relationships, particularly between somebody in a position of authority and your frontline teams. And that was really the focus of the intervention with them. And that's really what I'm going to focus a little bit more on in my time with you. WCB Yukon has amazing policies, procedures, and checklists. I read them. I love how simply they're written and easy to digest. So I'm not going to take you through that myself, but we're going to really focus a little bit more on the people and relationship part. And this really made sense to me as I thought about this. So as I said, there's no one thing, there's an integration of everything. And this is how I see this. So we need the legislation to tell us where we're trying to go, what we're trying to achieve. And then you all need your policies and procedures to make sure we get there, and that everybody can get there in the same way in the same time. I have no doubt you all have data that tells you how you're doing. Are you having incidents? Are you having recordables? What are the complaints coming in? The real magic here is, how do we get our people to go on that journey with us? How do we get all of our people to get behind protecting ourselves from violence and harassment in the workplace? And as I mentioned, there's a bit of a balance that we need, right? We need that knowledge, absolutely. And that will come in the pieces that you see there on the left. And then we also need those relationship pieces. So we need to have trusting relationships in the workplace, supportive, definitely credibility and reliability between, peers, and then also between supervisors and direct reports. And then intimacy is really interesting. I mean, it's not a word you often chat about in the workplace, but this is about your ability to connect with people. And when I think about all of the legislation that exists, right, whether it's in the Yukon territory, whether it's in, my hometown, my home province of Newfoundland, nowhere does this matter more to me than when we're talking about protecting ourselves from violence and harassment. There's little that's more personal than a hazard or a risk coming at you from another person. It's a very personal thing. So the balance of this is that much more important. So there are many, guiding principles that we hold fast to when we're trying to create safe cultures, productive businesses. These are the three, to me, that I wanted you to think and reflect on when it comes to implementing this legislation. And they're very important. And I've seen time and time again from leaders where they find this hard at first, but the power of hanging on to these and letting this guide you is really something. So the first one is showing your people that you care about them, right? And a lot of this comes to understanding the impact of your actions, right? I don't believe any of us get up in the morning with the intention of making somebody else have a crappy day, right? But really understanding, and some of this comes back to emotional intelligence, which is a whole other chat, self-awareness, about, are my actions demonstrating that I care about my teams? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want you to start thinking about that. I want you to start thinking about, if I asked your teams these questions, what would they say? The open discussion of violence and harassment hazards and risks is another guiding principle. And then you can see there, how do we know what actions we're looking for, take the time to go look for them in the workplace, and then positively recognize and reinforce them so that people continue to do them. So I'm going to just give you a second there with those. So think about that and think about what your teams might say if we had them as well and we're talking to them about that. And now what I want to do is just take some time to talk through each of them. And again, I'm going to be asking you some questions to reflect upon. We might share some things in the chat, and then some things that you can do when you go back. So I love this notion of intention. Communicate with intention, lead with intention. And leader's an interesting thing, right? Super powerful to be a leader in an organization. And what I mean by that is a leader who's in a position of authority. That's very powerful. You might be a leader because of the relationships and the influence that you have in the workplace. Maybe you're a health and safety professional on a safety committee, whatever the case. When we are known as a leader, what we say and how we say it really, really matters. People pay attention to what we're paying attention to. What we talk about shows value. The mill that I was talking to you about, one of the things when I did focus groups with them and was out in the mill and walking around and working with their leaders, safety was never spoken about. Forget about violence and harassment, because they had fights going on in the parking lot that had just been accepted. But everything that was discussed, everything that drove the decisions and the actions in that organization was productivity. So safety was never spoken about. So you can imagine that translates to teams that it doesn't matter, right? Really important as well, to get ahead of it. When we get ahead of something, it's demonstrating that we care about it. It's truly preventative, right? And not wait for something to happen. And one of the things, oh, I'm going to stop there for 1 sec to get somebody maybe on mute. I think we're good. Awesome. Thank you. Oh, maybe not. Mike, I don't know if you can mute.
Yeah, sorry, I have a participant here who for some reason I can't mute, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to remove that participant.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. And I just wanted
to
just give you notice that we're currently 18 minutes in.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Mike. So yes, this notion of talking about it before something happens and not because something happens, super, super powerful. I do find with violence and harassment, it takes a little bit to get comfortable to know how to talk about it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But there's many opportunities in the workplace to do this. When we onboard people, I've worked with some companies who just make it part of their onboarding. These are the hazards and risks that we have here. These are the actions and behaviors that we value. And this is what you do if something happens. So no different than how you orient someone to your health and safety, right? You bring it up. We had an employer recently who sent everybody to respectful workplace training, right? Awesome, super important. And I know you're going to hear from you, Fred, about some training as well. The next level when we do that, and that notion of, everything on the map that you need to do, that next step to elevate it is let's come back and talk about how that training applies to us as a team, right? Often what I find with, protecting ourselves against violence and harassment, or being resilient, or, making sure that we're protecting our mental health, is we do a lot for the individuals. right? I'm going to talk to Mike and I'm going to say, Mike, this is how you can build up your resiliency, or this is what you can do if you need help, which is all really important. The next step, though, is creating environments, right, where we talk about it together and figure out what it means for us as a team and what we do about it, to make sure that we are living and breathing what we're being taught and what we're being trained in. So the one question I have for you, and feel free in the chat if you want, but you don't have to. Again, a lot of my questioning is all about you reflecting. And this is just another example where I say this isn't, I don't ever want this to feel onerous, because this very simple thing about how you've been speaking about this new legislation in the workplace sends a really strong message to the people about whether the interest is in fact in protecting them, or whether it's going through the motions to implement a new piece of legislation, right? How we speak about this matters. What we call it, why we're doing it. Do we speak about it once and then never to speak about it again, right? Just that small thing about being intentional, purposeful, and planned in your communication is really powerful, right? Do your folks know that this new legislation is coming in, and what does it mean for us? You know, how do we have those conversations? And those conversations are easier to do if you have a workplace that already has strong relationships, right? Safe spaces to speak freely, debate, share concerns, all of that stuff. The next thing I want to talk about is this notion that, so the principle 2 was that we openly discuss violence and harassment hazards and risks, right? And I think from a physical perspective, my experience has been that most of us are pretty good at quickly jumping up and saying what the critical physical hazards and risks are, typically. So if I asked you in your chat to spit those out, what would you say? Just quickly, what are some of the key critical hazards and risks that you're seeing in your workplaces? None.
I think everybody needs a moment to type.
I'm moving to the Yukon. There we go. Slips and falls, absolutely, right? We work with, yep. Yeah, angry clients, yep, for sure. Tripping, awesome. Yeah, cold weather travel, I bet, yeah. Bears, I honestly do not hear that one quite as much down in my neck of the woods, but for sure. Awesome. So a nice mix, right? You're already thinking about that violence piece and the harassment piece as well. So what do they look like? What does a hazard or risk for harassment look like? What would you be looking for in the workplace to know whether there is a risk of harassment? How would you tell? In the chat there, if anybody wants to. Because my experience has been dealing with the public, absolutely. Yep. Increased absenteeism, certainly a flag. Conflicts, workplace culture, awesome. Low morale, yep. Making decisions that affect people. Threatening language, repeated anger, awesome. Isolating, very good one, yep. Grievances, poor leadership. Perfect. And you've nailed it, right? Especially someone said dealing with the public. So if you interact with people, you're at a risk of violence or harassment, right? Because we are just emotional beings, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to be injured because of it or necessarily experience it. And some of the magic there is recognizing when the risk gets elevated. I want you to just think about this. And I think Kurt explained this really well. And, you know, the answer to this is the process is really not super different when we're implementing this type of legislation versus another, right? We need to know who does what. As he said, policies, procedures for what we do, corrective action, training. We've all done this, right? This has been expected of us for a very long time with respect to health and safety in the workplace. What I do find people trip up in is knowing what to look for. So I loved that checklist. I love the checklist that exists in the guidebook to say, these might be some of the things, you've listed some of them. But when we're doing our inspections, what is it that we're looking for? What are we asking people so that we know whether there is a risk or not, either a physical harm or a mental harm? And some of you, I saw a lot of government industries popped up. You know, some of this is more obvious than others, and that's kind of why I chose the icons there that I did, right? It tends to be that extreme violence or physical harm is a little easier to wrap our heads around and identify and point out, and sometimes even mitigate, right? I worked with an employer, and I wasn't joking. They had fistfights at the workplace. That's not hard to jump in and say, okay, that needs to stop, right? It's where I find folks struggle is the more office type places, the gossip that we were talking that Kurt mentioned. You know, maybe meetings is a big place where we see some behaviors that would be unwanted and what to do about them. So my next thing for you is, as you reflect, as you go back into your workspaces, do you know what you're looking for, and how do you figure out what you need to be inspecting for, and how do you incorporate that into your inspections? And there's lots of ways to do it. And again, it's probably not that different than how you have learned what your key physical risk factors are already, right? So I'm not sure how many, would anybody in the chat be familiar with the psychological safety standard from CSA? Just a quick kind of yes, no, never heard of it, use it all the time. Yeah, we've got some. Awesome. That's great. Yep, some no's good. We use it a lot. So nice mix. So you've got some folks to help you out, just finished the courses. Awesome. So then some of you'd be familiar that there are 13 risk factors. So you can go to that standard and it will tell you what 13 risk factors are to psychological safety. And what I've pulled out of it there are the ones that really kind of line up with violence and harassment. They all do not, right? There's things about balance, work-life balance, workload. Somebody mentioned leadership. There is a standard around leadership expectations. But these 5 really lined up with respect to violence and harassment and psychological protection. So you have that. That is a place that you can go look at. And it tells you what to look for, and it tells you how to mitigate it. Of course, what's going on in the industry is going to tell you as well, right? Healthcare, nursing homes, elderly who are dealing with dementia and might have aggressive behaviors. We know what those key critical things are, but this is the powerful one. Ask your people when they feel threatened, right? They know. Ask the people doing the work when they feel that they have unwanted comments, unwanted behavior, and you almost normalize the conversation, just like you would if you're talking about any of the physical hazards or risks that we talk to people about. Another challenge here, and somebody did mention it, is how do you know that something bad might happen? How do you know that people might be escalating in their behavior? That would be another thing to turn your minds to, because then you need to get ahead of it and intervene, right? So, you know, a piece of machinery breaks a few times. Okay, well, that's something we need to address. What about on the people side of things? And there's many, you know, increased stress can increase conflict and increase behaviors and actions in the workplace that we may not want. There's a lot of, when you get in looking at your hazards and your risks, don't forget to think about what near misses look like for this legislation. And then what would this look like if everybody was protecting themselves in the workplace and acting in a way that this is a violent and harassment-free workplace? What would that look like? And I've spent times with leaders and organizations just talking about that and workshopping that to say, What would we see at all levels in the organization? What would we see at our meetings during our work that we're doing? And then be intentional in looking for those behaviors, recognizing them, and positively reinforcing them. And that really drives that behavior change. It illustrates what's important and what's valued in the organization. And it probably, one place to start that I always do is when you're doing a new policy or procedure, you want people to use it, right? So when people are using, they're reporting, those are things that we want to be recognizing and positively reinforcing in the workplace. So this was the map that I was telling you about. There isn't one thing, and it really takes us to be intentional to pull all of these things together to really implement the legislation, protect ourselves from violence and harassment, and make it just part of the way that we do things around here. I talked a little bit, so how are you communicating? When are you communicating? Are we doing it in the right way, the right time, the right method? Any opportunity that we have to talk about violence and harassment before something happens so that we're not reacting because something happens. Really get ahead of understanding what your risks and hazards are for violence and harassment. And again, your people are the very best resource for that. And then number 4, to me, I've never worked with a leadership group where this hasn't come up, that leaders say, I don't recognize positive actions enough. I don't, and it doesn't need to be a big, public display, but it's almost an acknowledgement. And they often will pull that into some personal action plans to be better at seeing a desirable action and then recognizing it, so that we ensure that it keeps going. And it's interesting, I think long before this was named or became a formal thing, there was a ton of evidence, certainly in my experience and in talking with people, that this mattered, that protecting ourselves and protecting our psychological safety mattered in the workplace. And it's really now becoming the thing that is being shown to be what is creating highly successful teams in the workplace. So it's the right thing to do. We are better when we're healthy at work. Our communities are better. And this is a huge part in that. So I really encourage you to come to the breakout room to share if you have any questions, any challenges that you have, if you have any learnings to share, happy to hear them. But I really hope, again, this was a scratching the surface, but I really hope that you had a few minutes to think, reflect, and then a couple little things that you can go to really get yourself and your teams off on the right foot, to protect yourselves against violence and harassment. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Nancy. I'd like to say that I really appreciate how you spoke to the way that we think about the legislation, the policies, the way that we frame workplace harassment and violence prevention in our own minds will really dictate how we bring that into our organizational cultures. And I think that illustrating that framing is so important, and I think you did a fantastic job of it. Thank you very much.